Every morning for 15 years, James Washington walked the same route to the Pioneer Steel Factory in Atlanta, Georgia. He never imagined that sharing his lunch with a shabby-looking new worker would change his life forever. But when that man revealed his true identity as Marcus Reynolds, the secretive billionaire owner of Pioneer Industries, James discovered that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can open the biggest doors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The January morning was bitter cold as James Washington trudged through the pre-dawn darkness toward Pioneer Steel. Steam rose from the maintenance grates, mixing with his breath in the frigid air. At 52, his knees ached more with each passing winter, but he couldn't afford to miss a day's work, not with his daughter's college tuition payments looming and his mother's medical bills piling up. The massive factory complex loomed ahead, its weathered brick walls and towering smokestacks casting long shadows in the security lights. James nodded to the guard at Gate B, just as he had every morning for the past 15 years. Inside, the familiar scent of metal shavings and machine oil filled his nostrils as he made his way to his locker, the sound of his work boots echoing through the nearly empty corridor. The break room buzzed with pre-shift conversation, but James kept to himself, organizing his lunch container and thermos of coffee. A few newer workers glanced his way. They'd heard about his reputation for training 3 generations of metal workers on the precision lathe, but James never bragged about it. Pride didn't pay bills, and these days, he needed every dollar he could earn. At his workstation, James methodically checked his tools and calibrated his equipment. The lathe he operated was older than some of his coworkers, but he knew every sound it made, every quirk in its operation. His hands moved automatically through the startup sequence as his mind drifted to the stack of bills waiting at home. The mortgage payment was due next week, and his mother's arthritis medication had doubled in price since the insurance company changed their coverage policy. His daughter Teresa's latest tuition statement had arrived yesterday, $12,000 for the upcoming semester at Georgia Tech. She was studying mechanical engineering, determined to design safer factory equipment, after what happened to James's wife Angela 5 years ago in an industrial accident. The settlement barely covered the medical bills, leaving nothing for Teresa's education. James had promised Angela before she passed that he would make sure their daughter got her degree, no matter what it took. The floor supervisor's whistle cut through James's thoughts. Production quotas had increased again last month, and 3 workers had already been let go for falling behind. James couldn't afford any mistakes. He focused on the steel rod taking shape beneath his careful hands, measuring twice before each cut. The precision required was absolute. These components would end up in aircraft engines, and one miscalculation could cost lives. By mid-morning, his back was already protesting, but James pushed through. During his brief water break, he overheard younger workers complaining about the working conditions, the increased quotas, the outdated equipment, the constant pressure from management. James kept quiet. He'd seen too many vocal employees suddenly disappear from the schedule. Besides, he had more immediate concerns. Teresa needed textbooks for the new semester, and his mother's doctor had recommended a new treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. The morning dragged on, punctuated by the rhythmic whirring of machines and the occasional shout of a supervisor. James maintained his steady pace, neither rushing nor slowing. He'd seen too many workers cut corners trying to meet quotas, but that wasn't his way. Angela had always admired his attention to detail, his commitment to doing things right. Sometimes he still caught himself turning to share a thought with her, forgetting for a moment that she was gone. When lunch finally arrived, James found his usual spot in the far corner of the cafeteria. The metal chair creaked as he settled in, unwrapping the simple sandwich he'd prepared that morning. Around him, groups of workers huddled together, sharing jokes and complaints, but James remained apart. After Angela's accident, he'd withdrawn from the social life of the factory. It was easier that way. Fewer questions, fewer reminders of what he'd lost. He thought about the upcoming weekend when Teresa would come home from college for a visit. She worried about him being alone too much, but James assured her he was fine. What else could he say? That some days the loneliness felt like a physical weight? That he missed her mother so much it still took his breath away? No, better to focus on work, on providing for his family, on keeping his promises. He was halfway through his sandwich when he noticed something unusual. A new face in the cafeteria. An older black man sat alone at a table near the window, wearing a maintenance uniform that seemed too large for his thin frame. The man's lunch consisted of nothing but a small piece of bread, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he ate. Nobody else seemed to notice him, or if they did, they chose to ignore him, as was common with new workers. James watched the man for a moment, remembering his own first days at Pioneer Steel, how overwhelming and lonely it had felt. He thought about Angela, how she'd always shared her lunch with new workers, making them feel welcome. "A little kindness costs nothing, James," she used to say. The memory tugged at something deep in his chest, a reminder of the person he used to be before grief and survival became his only concerns. He looked down at his own lunch, simple but adequate. The sandwich could easily be split, and he had an extra apple. For a long moment, James sat perfectly still, weighing his choices. Getting involved wasn't his way anymore, but sometimes he could still hear Angela's voice, still feel the warmth of her smile when she saw him doing something good for others. James Washington stood up slowly, gathered his lunch, and took the first steps toward the stranger's table, unaware that this simple decision would set in motion events that would change everything. The Pioneer Steel factory wasn't just a building. It was a sprawling complex of metal and concrete that dominated the industrial district of South Atlanta. Inside its walls, over 500 workers operated machinery that produced critical components for everything from commercial aircraft to military vehicles. The facility had been there for 40 years, and its age showed in every creaking conveyor belt and worn-out safety sign. James's department, Precision Manufacturing, occupied the east wing of the complex. Here the noise was constant, the grinding of metal against metal, the hiss of cooling systems, and the relentless whir of industrial fans. 20 lathes lined the main floor, each operated by a worker who knew that one mistake could mean termination. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor, where yellow safety lines had faded to barely visible streaks. Supervisor Marcus Thompson paced between the workstations, clipboard in hand, watching every movement with hawk-like intensity. He was new, brought in 6 months ago when the corporation decided to optimize efficiency. 3 long-time employees had already been fired under his watch for failing to meet the increased quotas. The tension on the floor was palpable. Everyone knew they could be next. "Washington," Thompson's voice cut through the mechanical din. "Your output numbers from yesterday were 5 units below target." He stood at James's station, frowning at his clipboard. "Corporate's watching these metrics closely. We can't afford any slack." James kept his eyes on his work, carefully measuring the steel component in his hands. "Yes, sir. Had to recalibrate the machine twice yesterday. Better to get it right than risk defects." His voice remained neutral, despite the frustration building in his chest. The new quotas barely left time for proper quality checks, but he refused to compromise on safety. Around him, other workers kept their heads down, but James could sense their attention. Everyone knew about his wife Angela's accident at the crosstown facility, how faulty equipment had taken her life because someone had rushed maintenance to meet deadlines. The settlement papers had required his silence about the details, but the story had spread anyway. The morning crept forward, marked by the rhythmic sounds of machinery and the occasional burst of compressed air from the cleaning stations. James noticed young Marcus, barely 22, struggling with his lathe 2 stations down. The boy was new, replacing veteran worker Carl Jenkins, who'd been let go last month. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his measurements, fear of making a mistake visible in every movement. The air itself seemed heavy with more than just metal dust. Every worker carried invisible burdens: medical bills, mortgages, children's education costs. Many had second jobs, working nights or weekends just to make ends meet. The factory paid better than retail or fast food, but in Atlanta's rising cost of living, better wasn't always enough. During the mid-morning break, James overheard snippets of conversation near the water cooler. "Did you hear? They're bringing in consultants next week. Yeah, efficiency experts, they call them. Bet they're looking to cut more jobs, automate what they can. The words carried an undercurrent of anxiety that had become all too familiar. The break room wall were covered with safety posters and corporate motivational messages. Quality first. Safety is everyone's responsibility. Excellence through efficiency. Below them, bulletin boards displayed production targets and accident-free day counts. The current number stood at 47, a source of pride for management, though workers knew it didn't tell the whole story about near misses and unreported incidents. James watched as Sarah Chen, one of the few women on the floor, flexed her wrist between cuts. She'd been asking for an ergonomic adjustment to her station for weeks, but maintenance requests kept getting delayed. Budget cuts had hit every department except executive bonuses, according to the rumors circulating through break room conversations. Near the quality control station, James noticed a small group of workers huddled around a phone looking at job listings during their break. The younger ones talked about going back to school, learning programming or healthcare. The older workers, like James, remained silent. They knew their options were limited. Age discrimination might go unnamed, but its reality shaped their choices. The floor manager's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing yet another mandatory overtime weekend. Groans rippled through the workspace, quickly stifled as supervisors glanced around. Workers exchanged knowing looks. Families would have to adjust. Second jobs would have to be rescheduled. Childcare arrangements would need to be changed again. The afternoon shift would bring its own challenges. Temperature control in the building had been inconsistent since the maintenance budget was cut. Some areas became unbearably hot while others remained cold enough to see your breath. Workers had learned to layer their clothing, adapting to the facility's quirks just as they adapted to everything else. In the far corner, the old-timers section housed the most experienced workers, many approaching retirement age. They operated the most temperamental machines with a practiced ease born of decades of experience. But their numbers were dwindling. Early retirement packages and performance improvements had thinned their ranks. With them went years of institutional knowledge, replaced by younger workers trained on newer, automated systems. As lunch approached, the floor manager made his rounds, posting updated production requirements for the next quarter. The numbers drew quiet groans and shaken heads. Each increase meant more pressure, more stress, more risk of mistakes. But nobody spoke up. Not anymore. Not since the union talks had been shut down last year, followed by a wave of performance-based terminations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The machines hummed on, indifferent to the human stories playing out among them. In this industrial ecosystem, workers were interchangeable parts, replaceable, disposable, measured only by their output numbers. Yet, among them, invisible but real, ran threads of shared experience, silent understanding, and occasional moments of humanity that survived despite the grinding pressure to produce. James wiped the sweat from his brow, checking his watch. 10 minutes until lunch break. His shoulders ached from maintaining the precise posture his work required, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not with Teresa's tuition due and his mother's medications to consider. The factory might be wearing him down, but it was still the best option he had. A thought that echoed through the minds of hundreds of workers around him, each caught in their own version of the same story. After his shift ended at Pioneer Steel, James made his way through Atlanta's rush-hour traffic to his mother's small house in the Cascade Heights neighborhood. The modest home, with its peeling paint and sagging porch steps, had been in their family for 3 generations. Now, like everything else in his life, it required more attention than he could give. Inside, he found his mother, Martha Washington, sitting in her favorite armchair, arthritis-twisted hands folded in her lap. Medical equipment crowded the living room. An oxygen tank, a blood pressure monitor, and a small table covered with prescription bottles. The evening news played softly on an old television, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "How are you feeling today, Mama?" James asked, setting down his lunchbox and work bag. He immediately went to check her medication organizer, making sure she hadn't missed any doses. "Same as always, baby," Martha replied, her voice carrying that familiar mix of strength and weariness. "Dr. Bailey called today. Says they've got some new treatment options, but—" She trailed off, both of them knowing what came next. New treatments meant new expenses. James settled into the worn couch, pulling out the stack of bills he'd been avoiding. The mortgage statement showed another late fee, the third this year. The electricity bill had nearly doubled since winter set in, and the insurance company had sent another letter about denying coverage for his mother's latest prescription. His phone buzzed. A text from Teresa. "Dad," the university bursar's office called. "Need to talk about next semester's payment plan. Can you call when you're free?" James rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down. Teresa was in her junior year at Georgia Tech, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at the campus library. She was determined to become an engineer, to design safer industrial equipment. "No one else should lose their mom like I did," she'd said when declaring her major. The doorbell rang, and James opened it to find his sister, Michelle, holding several grocery bags. She worked as a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital, often stopping by after her shifts to help with their mother's care. "You look tired, James," she said, unpacking the groceries. "Have you eaten anything since lunch?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed again, this time an email from the mortgage company. They were threatening foreclosure if he didn't bring the payments current within 30 days. James quickly closed the message, not wanting his mother to see his expression. "Teresa called me," Michelle said quietly as they moved into the kitchen. "She's worried about dropping out if she can't secure more financial aid. James, maybe it's time to consider selling the house. We could move Mama into my place, use the money to—" "No," James cut her off firmly. "This house is all Mama has left. After Daddy died in '92, she worked 3 jobs to keep it. I'm not taking that from her." He didn't mention that the house's value had dropped significantly since the new highway bypass had been built, or that the needed repairs would eat up any profit from a sale. Michelle sighed, pulling out their mother's medication chart. "Then what's the plan?" Her new arthritis medication costs $600 a month. Insurance only covers half. Teresa's tuition is due in 3 weeks. "And you?" She paused, looking at her brother's exhausted face. "You can't keep carrying everything alone." James moved to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Angela loved this view. She'd always said it reminded her that even the hardest days eventually ended in beauty. 5 years since the accident, and her absence still felt like a fresh wound. "I've got some overtime coming up at the factory," he said, "and I might be able to pick up some weekend work at Johnson's Automotive. They're always looking for experienced machinists." "You're already working 60 hours a week," Michelle protested. "When was the last time you had a full day's rest? What happens if you get sick or hurt? Who takes care of Mama then?" Their conversation was interrupted by a small crash from the living room. They rushed in to find their mother had dropped her water glass, her hands shaking too badly to hold it. As James carefully helped her up while Michelle cleaned the spilled water, he saw tears in his mother's eyes. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," Martha whispered. "If your father was here—" "Don't talk like that, Mama," James said firmly, helping her back to her chair. "We're family, we take care of each other." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the crushing pressure of their truth. Family meant responsibility, meant sacrifice, meant doing whatever it took to keep everyone afloat. Later that night, after Michelle had gone home and his mother was asleep, James sat at the kitchen table with his calculator and bills spread before him. The numbers refused to add up no matter how he arranged them. Teresa's tuition, $12,000. Mother's medications, $1,800 for the next 3 months. Mortgage payment plus late fees, $2,400. Essential house repairs, at least $3,000. His own bank account showed a balance of $847.32. His next paycheck would barely cover the mortgage payment. The overtime at the factory might bring in an extra $400 if he could maintain the demanding pace without making mistakes. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. James leaned back in his chair, bone-tired but too worried to sleep. Tomorrow he'd have to be back at the factory by 6 a.m., ready to face another day of precise measurements and impossible quotas. He couldn't afford to show fatigue, couldn't risk making errors that might cost him his job. Too many people depended on him. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, counting down the hours until another dawn. James Washington closed his eyes, offering up a silent prayer for strength, for guidance, for some way to keep his promises to everyone who counted on him. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow's lunch break would change everything, though not in any way he could have imagined. The factory floor was unusually quiet the next morning as James arrived for his shift. An unfamiliar tension hung in the air, fueled by rumors of upcoming corporate visits and potential layoffs. He noticed several managers huddled near the supervisor's office, speaking in hushed tones while consulting tablets and clipboards. At his workstation, James found a memo detailing new quality control procedures. The requirements had become even more stringent, with zero tolerance for even minor deviations. His hands moved automatically through the morning setup routine, while his mind wandered to last night's bills and Teresa's tuition deadline. Around mid-morning, whispers spread through the factory about a new worker in the maintenance department. James hadn't paid much attention until he heard someone mention that the newcomer was different. Looking up briefly from his lathe, he caught glimpses of an older black man in oversized coveralls quietly moving between machinery with cleaning supplies. "Hey, Washington," called Tommy Chen from the next station. "Heard they're bringing in more temps, paying them half what we make. Bet that's why corporate's been around more lately." James kept his focus on his work, but he couldn't help noticing how other workers treated the newcomer. Some openly stared, others whispered behind their hands. A few made dismissive gestures when the man passed by. The stranger maintained his dignity, methodically cleaning and checking equipment, though James noticed his hands trembled slightly when reaching for tools. During the morning break, James overheard more conversations about the mysterious new worker. "Did you see how he just showed up with no training? Bet he's a corporate spy." "Nah, probably just another cost-cutting measure." The speculation grew wilder with each retelling, but the man himself remained silent, keeping to his tasks. By lunchtime, James's curiosity had grown. He watched as the new worker made his way to the cafeteria, carrying what looked like a paper bag containing a meager lunch. The man chose a corner table far from the regular groups and sat alone. His coveralls, James noticed, were not just oversized but worn and faded, as if they'd been acquired from a second-hand store. The stranger's movements caught James's attention. Despite his apparent age and humble appearance, there was something dignified in his bearing. His hands, though weathered, moved with precise care as he opened his lunch. Nothing but a small piece of dry bread and a paper cup of water. James found himself studying the man more closely. There was something familiar about his careful movements, the way he observed his surroundings while appearing not to notice anything. It reminded him of his father, who'd worked in factories for 40 years, always watching, always learning. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime conversations, but James noticed how others deliberately avoided the new workers' table. Even the usually friendly maintenance crew kept their distance. The man's isolation was deliberate, created by invisible barriers of suspicion and prejudice that James knew all too well. A group of younger workers passed by the stranger's table, one of them deliberately bumping it. The man's water cup tipped, spilling across the metal surface. No one stopped to help. The man quietly used his sleeve to wipe up the spill, his dignity intact despite the clear provocation. James felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same feeling he'd had countless times in his career when facing similar treatment. He remembered his first days at Pioneer Steel, how some had questioned his qualifications, doubted his skill, and watched for any mistake they could use against him. He'd survived by keeping his head down, proving himself through perfect work, never giving them an excuse. But something about this situation felt different. The stranger's quiet dignity, his obvious need, the deliberately cruel treatment by others. It all struck too close to home. James thought about his father's words. "Son, Sometimes standing aside is the same as standing against. He thought about Angela, how she'd always reached out to new workers, especially those others ignored. Looking down at his own lunch, a sandwich, an apple, and some cookies Teresa had baked, James felt the weight of decision. His own struggles were heavy enough without taking on someone else's burdens. He had his family to think about, his precarious position to protect, getting involved, showing kindness to someone others had marked as an outsider. It could draw unwanted attention. Yet as he watched the older man sit there with nothing but dry bread, James remembered something else his father used to say. Your character shows most when doing right costs something. The memory of Angela's generous spirit, his father's quiet wisdom, and his own experiences of isolation all pulled at him. With slow deliberation, James Washington stood up from his usual solitary table. His movement drew a few curious glances. He never deviated from his routine. But for once, he didn't care about the attention. Sometimes he realized the right thing to do was also the hard thing. Taking a deep breath, James gathered his lunch and walked towards the stranger's table, aware that his simple action was already drawing whispers and stares. He was about to discover that this small act of kindness would set in motion changes he could never have anticipated. James approached the stranger's table, hyper-aware of the eyes following his movement across the cafeteria. "Mind if I join you?" he asked quietly. The older man looked up, surprised briefly, crossing his weathered features before he gestured to the empty chair. "Name's James Washington," he said, settling into the metal seat. Up close, he noticed the man's coveralls had a name tag that read simply, Ray. The stranger nodded in acknowledgement but remained silent, his hands folded carefully around his piece of dry bread. Without fanfare, James unwrapped his sandwich and split it in half. "My wife Angela used to say no one should eat alone their first week," he said, offering one portion to Ray. The man hesitated, dignity warring with obvious hunger in his expression. "That's very kind, but I couldn't," Ray began, his voice carrying a gentle, educated tone that seemed at odds with his worn appearance. "Please," James insisted. "I've got more than enough." He placed half the sandwich and his apple on a napkin, sliding them across the table. The whispers around them grew louder, but James ignored them. Ray accepted the food with quiet grace. "Thank you, Mr. Washington. Kindness is rare in places like this." His eyes, James noticed, were sharp and observant, taking in everything while revealing nothing. "Call me James," he replied, unwrapping his own portion. "How long have you been in manufacturing?" The question was casual, but James watched carefully for the response. Ray paused before answering, as if weighing his words. "I've spent many years observing industrial operations," he said carefully, "though recently I've developed a particular interest in understanding the human element of production." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crash from a nearby table. A group of younger workers had accidentally knocked over their drinks, sending liquid spreading toward Ray's feet. James noticed how they watched, waiting to see if the new maintenance man would scramble to clean up their mess. Instead, Ray remained seated, his dignity intact. James stood, grabbed some paper towels, and calmly cleaned the spill himself. The younger workers drifted away, disappointed by the lack of reaction. "You didn't have to do that," Ray said softly. "No," James agreed. "But sometimes standing together matters more than standing apart." He returned to his seat, noticing how Supervisor Thompson watched from across the room, making notes on his ever-present clipboard. As they ate, Ray asked about James's family. There was something in his manner that invited trust, a genuine interest that went beyond casual conversation. James found himself sharing about Teresa's engineering studies, his mother's health struggles, and even, briefly, about Angela's accident. "Your daughter wants to design safer equipment?" Ray's eyes sharpened with interest. "That's admirable. Too many companies prioritize profit over worker safety." James nodded, surprised by the man's insight. 5 years since we lost Angela and nothing's really changed. Same rushed maintenance, Same pressure to cut corners. He lowered his voice. Sometimes I wonder if anyone in management actually cares about the people down here. Ray was quiet for a moment, studying his hands. Perhaps some do care but feel constrained by systems they didn't create. What would you change if you had the power? The question caught James off guard. No one had ever asked his opinion about factory operations before. He thought carefully before answering. First, I'd make sure maintenance requests got proper attention. Can't expect quality work from failing equipment. Then I'd adjust the quotas to allow for proper safety checks. Might slow production slightly, but it'd prevent costly mistakes and accidents. Ray listened intently, occasionally asking precise, thoughtful questions about specific processes and safety protocols. His knowledge seemed too detailed for a simple maintenance worker, but James was too engaged in the conversation to dwell on the inconsistency. As lunch break neared its end, Ray carefully wrapped the remaining portion of his bread. Thank you, James. Not just for the food, but for the conversation. It's given me much to consider. James stood, gathering his trash. Tomorrow's Friday. Bring you something hot from the deli down the street if you'd like. The offer surprised even himself. He rarely spent extra money on lunch. Ray smiled, a warm expression that transformed his entire face. That's very generous, but please don't trouble yourself. You've already shown me more kindness than I expected to find here. As they parted ways, James noticed Supervisor Thompson approaching his workstation. The man's expression suggested trouble, but James felt strangely calm about his decision. Whatever consequences came from helping Ray, he knew he'd done the right thing. Throughout the afternoon, James caught glimpses of Ray moving through the factory, cleaning and observing. There was something about the man's careful attention to detail, his quiet dignity in the face of others' dismissal, that nagged at James's mind. But he had quotas to meet and precision cuts to make. Mysteries would have to wait. That evening, driving home to his mother's house, James replayed the conversation in his mind. Ray's questions had been specific, almost strategic, as if he was gathering information rather than making small talk. Yet his interest in worker safety and conditions had seemed genuine, especially when discussing Teresa's engineering goals. James pulled into his driveway, still thinking about the strange encounter. Something was different about Ray. He just couldn't put his finger on what. But for the first time in years, he felt like someone had actually listened to his concerns about the factory and actually cared about the workers' perspectives. Little did James know, his simple act of kindness had set wheels in motion that would transform not just his own life, but the entire culture of Pioneer Steel. The next morning, James arrived at Pioneer Steel to find the atmosphere even more tense than usual. A memo had been posted overnight announcing mandatory Saturday shifts for the next month. More concerning were the whispers about corporate observers conducting stealth evaluations of workers. At his station, James noticed his machine was acting sluggish. The calibration seemed off, despite his careful setup. He'd maintained this lathe for years and knew something wasn't right. A quick inspection revealed that someone had tampered with the settings, subtle changes that could cause quality issues or safety problems. Having trouble with your equipment, Washington? Supervisor Thompson appeared suddenly, clipboard ready. That's the second issue this week. Maybe the pressure's getting to you. His tone carried a clear threat. No, sir, James replied calmly, though his heart raced. Someone's been adjusting the settings after hours. See these marks here? That's not normal wear. He pointed to fresh scratches near the calibration panel. Thompson scoffed. Excuses won't meet quotas. One more incident, and I'll have to write you up. He stalked away, already marking something on his clipboard. Throughout the morning, James felt eyes on him. Several younger workers who'd witnessed yesterday's lunch incident gave him a wide berth. Others whispered when he passed. He caught fragments. Getting involved with that spy. Should know better. Asking for trouble. During the morning break, Michael Chen, a longtime colleague, pulled James aside. Listen, man, you need to be careful. Word is Thompson's building a case against troublemakers. Says corporate wants to streamline operations. He glanced around nervously. That new guy you were talking to? Nobody knows where he came from. No paperwork, no transfer records. James nodded, processing this information. He'd suspected Ray wasn't a typical maintenance worker, but hearing it confirmed made him uneasy. Still, something about the man's genuine interest in worker safety resonated with him. Near noon, James noticed more management types touring the facility. They wore expensive suits and carried tablets, making notes as they observed operations. One of them lingered near his station, watching his precise movements at the lathe. When lunch finally arrived, James headed to the cafeteria with a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. Ray sat at the same corner table, again with nothing but a small piece of bread. As James approached, he noticed several supervisors watching intently. "Mind if I join you again?" James asked, setting down his lunch. Ray's face brightened with genuine warmth, though James noticed dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept. "How's your daughter's studies going?" Ray asked after they'd settled in. The question surprised James. He hadn't expected the man to remember such details from yesterday's conversation. Before James could answer, a group of workers accidentally bumped their table, spilling drinks. This time, the incident felt more deliberate, more hostile. James noticed Thompson watching from across the room, making no move to intervene. "Perhaps I should eat elsewhere," Ray said quietly. "I don't want to cause you trouble." James felt anger rising in his chest. "No," he said firmly. "This is exactly what they want. People too scared to show basic human decency." He split his sandwich again, passing half to Ray. "My father used to say, courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing right, even when you're afraid." Throughout the afternoon, the pressure intensified. James's machine continued to malfunction in small ways, requiring constant adjustments. Each problem drew Thompson's attention and another note on his clipboard. Quality control rejected 2 of James's pieces, the first rejections he'd had in months. Near the end of his shift, James overheard 2 supervisors discussing upcoming personnel adjustments. His name came up, followed by phrases like attitude problem and disruptive influence. The message was clear. His simple act of kindness had marked him as a target. That evening driving home, James wrestled with his choices. He had responsibilities, his mother's care, Teresa's education. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Yet something about Ray's questions, his careful observations, suggested there was more happening than simple workplace harassment. At home, he found Teresa waiting. She'd driven down from college to discuss her tuition situation. "Dad, you look worried," she said, hugging him. "Is everything okay at work?" James managed a smile. "Just some changes happening. Nothing I can't handle." But as they sat down to review her college expenses, the weight of his situation pressed heavily. One wrong move, one more incident, and everything could fall apart. Later, lying awake in bed, James thought about Ray's questions about worker safety and factory conditions. The man's knowledge had been too specific, his interest too focused. Whatever was happening at Pioneer Steel, Ray was clearly more than a simple maintenance worker. Tomorrow would bring more pressure, more challenges. But as James finally drifted off to sleep, he realized he didn't regret helping Ray. Sometimes, he thought, the right path was clear even when the destination wasn't. The next day started with a chill that seemed to seep through the factory walls. James arrived early, hoping to check his machine before the shift started. To his surprise, he found Ray already there, methodically cleaning around the equipment in the dim morning light. "Morning," James called softly. Ray looked up, offering a slight smile. In the early morning light, James noticed details he'd missed before. The way Ray's hands moved with practiced precision, how his eyes caught every detail of the machinery, the subtle confidence in his posture that seemed at odds with his worn coveralls. "Your calibration was off yesterday," Ray said, gesturing to James's lathe. "I took the liberty of checking it this morning. Someone's been tampering with the depth gauge. His voice carried a note of concern that seemed deeper than casual observation, almost protective. James examined the machine, finding it perfectly adjusted. "You know your way around these models," he remarked, watching Ray's reaction carefully. "Most maintenance workers stick to basic cleaning and lubrication." "I've spent time studying industrial equipment," Ray replied, his words measured. "Particularly safety mechanisms. Your daughter's interest in designing safer machinery. It resonates with me." He paused, then added, "I lost someone too, years ago. A preventable accident. The company valued speed over safety, just like they often do here. They worked in companionable silence for a while, James running his pre-shift checks while Ray cleaned nearby. The factory gradually came to life around them, other workers filtering in, machines humming to life one by one. Finally, Ray spoke again. "Tell me more about your family, James. You mentioned your mother needs expensive medication?" Something in Ray's tone encouraged honesty. James found himself sharing details he rarely discussed: the struggle to afford his mother's arthritis treatments, the way insurance kept denying claims, Teresa's determination to finish college despite mounting costs, the weight of trying to hold everything together alone. Ray listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed genuine concern. "It must be difficult," Ray observed, "carrying so much responsibility while working in these conditions." He gestured around the factory floor where workers hurried to meet their quotas. "I've noticed how the pressure affects everyone here. The fear, the competition, the corners being cut. It creates a cycle of stress that impacts both safety and quality." James nodded, surprised by Ray's insight. "Been worse lately. New management, higher quotas, less maintenance. Sometimes it feels like they've forgotten we're people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Last month they cut the training program for new hires, just threw them on the line with a manual." Ray's eyes sharpened with interest. "If you could change things, what would you do differently, speaking as someone who's worked here for years?" "First," James said, warming to the subject, "I'd fix the maintenance schedules. Can't expect quality work from broken equipment. Then address the safety protocols. We need real training, not just paperwork. And the quotas—" He stopped, realizing he might be saying too much to someone he barely knew. But Ray encouraged him to continue, asking specific questions about production processes, worker conditions, and safety measures. His questions revealed a deep understanding of industrial operations, far beyond what a maintenance worker should know. He seemed particularly interested in the disconnect between management policies and shop floor realities. During lunch, they shared another meal. This time, Ray had brought nothing at all. James divided his food without comment, noticing how other workers still kept their distance. The hostility from yesterday had transformed into wary observation. Some workers quickly looked away when Ray glanced in their direction. "Your colleagues fear association with me might cause them trouble," Ray observed quietly, picking up half of the sandwich James had shared. "It's telling how quickly fear spreads in an environment like this." "They're scared," James replied, watching a group of workers hurry past their table. "One mistake, one complaint, and they could lose everything. Most have families, loans, medical bills. Can't blame them for playing it safe. Factory jobs are harder to find these days." Ray studied him thoughtfully. "Yet you chose differently. Why risk your position to help a stranger?" James considered the question carefully. "My father taught me character isn't what you do when it's easy, but what you do when it costs something. And my wife, Angela—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "She always said kindness matters most when it's hardest to give. Before the accident, she was always the first to help new workers feel welcome." Throughout their conversation, Ray asked about James's experiences at Pioneer Steel, the changes he'd seen over 15 years, the accidents he'd witnessed, the improvements he'd suggest if he had the authority. His questions were precise, almost like an investigation, but his interest seemed genuinely focused on worker welfare rather than gathering dirt for management. You've given me much to think about, James, Ray said as lunch ended. Your perspective on these issues is valuable, more valuable than you might realize. That afternoon, James noticed more suits touring the facility. They clustered in groups, speaking in low voices and making notes on tablets. Occasionally, they'd glance in his direction, then look away quickly when he noticed. The atmosphere felt charged, as if something significant was building beneath the surface. Near the end of his shift, James saw Ray speaking with one of the corporate visitors. Something in their interaction seemed off. The suited man's respectful posture, Ray's subtle air of authority, the difference in the visitor's body language. But before James could observe more, Supervisor Thompson appeared, demanding an immediate quality check of his output. The crisis hit early Monday morning. James arrived to find his workstation cordoned off with yellow tape. Supervisor Thompson stood waiting, flanked by 2 security guards. "Washington, we need you in the office. Now." Thompson's voice carried barely concealed satisfaction. Inside the cramped supervisor's office, James faced a table covered with rejected parts, all supposedly from his station. Quality control reports showed critical defects in over a dozen components. The paperwork claimed they'd all been produced during his last shift. "These parts could have caused catastrophic failure," Thompson said, shuffling through documents. "Aircraft components, Washington. Lives are at stake. We take this very seriously." James examined the parts carefully. "These aren't mine," he stated firmly. "Look at the cutting pattern. Completely different from my work. Someone's trying to set me up." "Quite an accusation," Thompson replied. "Got any proof?" "Because all our documentation shows these came from your station, during your shift." James's mind raced. He knew his work, knew he hadn't produced these parts, but proving it would be another matter entirely. The factory's tracking system was basic. They logged production numbers but didn't track individual pieces. "We're placing you on immediate suspension, pending investigation," Thompson announced. "Security will escort you out. Don't contact other employees. Don't return to the facility without authorization." James felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Suspension meant no pay. No payment, no mortgage payment, no medical bills covered, no tuition for Teresa. Everything he'd worked for balanced on a knife's edge. "Can I at least gather my personal items?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Security will collect them," Thompson replied dismissively. "We can't risk evidence being tampered with." As the guards led him through the factory floor, James caught glimpses of his co-workers quickly looking away. Only young Marcus, the new hire he'd been training, met his eyes with a troubled expression. Near the exit, James spotted Ray watching from the shadows. Their eyes met briefly, and James saw genuine concern in the older man's face. But before anything could be said, the guards urged him forward. Outside, the morning sun felt harsh and accusing. James sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. How would he tell his mother, Teresa, his sister? The weight of responsibility threatened to crush him. His phone buzzed, a text from Michelle. "Mom's medicine ran out. Need to pick up refills. $600 copay. Can you help?" James stared at the message until the screen went dark. The timing couldn't be worse. At home, he found his mother dozing in her chair. The sight of her peaceful face made his throat tight. How could he tell her he might lose everything? "James?" She stirred, opening her eyes. "Why are you home so early, baby?" He tried to explain gently, watching her face crumple with worry. "It's a mistake," he assured her. "They'll figure it out." But the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. His phone kept buzzing. Teresa calling, probably about tuition. Michelle about the medicine. Bill collectors who seemed to sense blood in the water. James let them all go to voicemail. He needed time to think. By evening, word had spread. Michelle arrived, her nurse's scrub still on from her shift. "This isn't right," she declared. "You've worked there for 15 years. Your quality record is perfect. They can't just—" "They can," James interrupted quietly. "And they did." Teresa called again. This time, he answered. Her voice was tight with concern. "Dad, what's happening? Are you okay?" "Everything's fine, baby girl," he lied. "Just a misunderstanding at work. Focus on your studies." He couldn't bear to tell her the truth, that her next semester might be in jeopardy. Late that night, James sat at the kitchen table, bills spread before him like a battlefield map. The mortgage payment was due in 10 days. His mother's medicine needed refilling. Teresa's tuition deadline loomed. His small savings wouldn't cover even half of it. His phone lit up with an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "James?" Ray's voice was soft but clear. "I heard what happened. Meet me tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. at Carter's Diner down the street from the factory. I think I can help." James hesitated. Meeting Ray might violate the terms of his suspension, but what did he have to lose? "I'll be there," he said finally. After hanging up, James walked through his quiet house. His mother's medical equipment hummed in the darkness. Family photos lined the walls. His father in his work clothes, Angela's bright smile, Teresa's graduation. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd promised to protect, hung by a thread. Tomorrow's meeting with Ray might be his last chance. But as James finally lay down to sleep, his mind churned with questions. Who was Ray really? Why would he want to help? And most importantly, could he be trusted? Carter's Diner was nearly empty when James arrived the next morning. Ray sat in a corner booth, but he looked different. Gone were the worn coveralls and weathered appearance. Instead, he wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than James made in 3 months. "Thank you for coming, James," Ray said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I believe it's time for proper introductions. My name is Raymond Ellis. I own Pioneer Industries." James felt the air leave his lungs. Raymond Ellis, the reclusive billionaire who'd built Pioneer from a single factory into a global corporation. The man whose signature was on every paycheck James had received for 15 years. "I spend time each year working alongside employees in different facilities," Ray continued. "It helps me understand the real conditions, not just what reports show. Your factory was next on my list." James sat in stunned silence as Ray explained. The corporate visitors, the efficiency experts, the rumors of evaluation, all part of his assessment of Pioneer Steel's operations. But what had caught his attention was James's simple act of kindness to a stranger. "In 15 years of doing this, you're the first person who offered to share their lunch without knowing who I was," Ray said softly. "But more importantly, you showed integrity in every action. Perfect quality records, helping new workers, speaking up about safety concerns even when it might cost you." "The defective parts," James managed to say, "they weren't mine." "We know," Ray replied. "Security cameras caught third-shift workers tampering with your station. Thompson orchestrated it. He's been taking kickbacks to push out experienced workers, replace them with undertrained temps. We've been building a case for months." Ray pulled out a folder. "Thompson's been terminated. The workers involved in the sabotage have been suspended. Your suspension is lifted with full back pay." He paused. "But I'm not just here to reinstate you." He slid another document across the table. "Pioneer Steel needs a new operations manager. Someone who understands the shop floor, who puts safety first, who treats workers like human beings. The position comes with a significant salary increase, full benefits, and a comprehensive education package for dependents." "Let's start with safety protocols," James said, thinking of Angela. "I've reviewed our maintenance schedules and training procedures. Both need immediate attention." He pulled up documentation Ray had helped him prepare, laying out a comprehensive overhaul of factory operations. Some department heads pushed back. "These changes will slow production," one argued. "We have quotas to meet." "Safety and quality drive profit," James replied, remembering Ray's words during their training sessions. "Accidents and defects cost more than proper maintenance and training. We're not sacrificing workers to meet numbers anymore." Throughout that first day, James walked the factory floor, not as a worker now, but as someone who could actually implement change. He spoke with operators he'd known for years, listened to their concerns, and took notes on needed improvements. His work clothes might have changed, but his understanding of their challenges hadn't. At lunch, he found himself standing in the cafeteria, tray in hand. His new position came with access to the management dining room, but that felt wrong. He chose his old corner table instead. Slowly, a few workers joined him. First young Marcus, then others. They talked about family, about work conditions, about hopes for change. The afternoon brought challenges. Budget reports needed review, staffing decisions required attention, and corporate headquarters demanded updates. James's head spun with new terminology and responsibilities. But every time he felt overwhelmed, he remembered Ray's words. Lead with integrity, and the rest will follow. That evening, driving home in his still reliable old car, despite Ray's offer of a company vehicle, James reflected on the day's events. He'd approved 3 emergency maintenance requests that would have been denied before. He'd initiated a review of safety training procedures. Small steps, but in the right direction. At home, his mother noticed the new suit, the different posture. You look like your father, she said softly. He always wanted more for you than factory work. It's still factory work, Mama, James replied. Just from a different angle. He showed her the new insurance cards that had arrived. Premium coverage that would finally give her access to the best treatments. Teresa called later, excited about the education benefits. Dad, I can apply for the master's program and they have internships in the engineering department. Her voice carried the same passion for improving worker safety that had driven her since losing her mother. James's sister, Michelle, visited, bringing dinner and questions. Are you sure about this? Management isn't always kind to people who try to change things. Ray's different, James explained. He wants real change, and he's giving me the authority to make it happen. He showed her the proposed budget for facility improvements, numbers that made her eyes widen. Later that night, James sat at his desk, reviewing files from his first day. The responsibility felt heavy, but not crushing. He had a chance to make the changes he'd always wished for, to create the kind of workplace where another family wouldn't lose a loved one to preventable accidents. His phone buzzed with a message from Ray. How was your first day? James replied honestly. Challenging, but necessary. Ray's response came quickly. That's exactly why you're the right person for this job. Change isn't easy, but it matters. Keep leading with integrity. As James prepared for bed, he noticed his old lunchbox sitting on the kitchen counter. Such a small thing, sharing a meal with someone who seemed in need. Yet that simple act of kindness had opened doors he never imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more decisions, more opportunities to make a difference. But for the first time in years, the future held more hope than fear. Over the next 3 months, Pioneer Steel underwent a dramatic transformation under James's leadership. His first major initiative was implementing a comprehensive maintenance overhaul. Every piece of equipment received thorough inspection and necessary repairs. The cost was significant, but Ray backed the decision fully, understanding that long-term success required proper investment. James explained to the board during their quarterly review. He presented data showing how improved maintenance had already reduced downtime and defects by 30%. The numbers spoke for themselves, but James made sure to emphasize the human impact. Fewer injuries, less stress, and improved morale among workers. Safety training became mandatory for all employees, regardless of experience level. James brought in experts to develop proper protocols, insisting that procedures be practical, not just theoretical. He often participated in training sessions himself, demonstrating that management took safety seriously. His presence on the floor during these sessions helped break down the traditional barriers between workers and management. Remember why we're doing this, he told a group of skeptical supervisors. Every worker here has family waiting at home. We owe them more than just a paycheck. We owe them peace of mind. The words carried extra weight coming from someone who'd lost his wife to poor safety practices. He shared Angela's story during training sessions, turning tragedy into motivation for change. The physical layout of the factory floor saw significant changes too. Workstations were redesigned for better ergonomics with adjustable heights and improved lighting. Safety equipment became easily accessible, stored at strategic points throughout the facility. Break areas were improved with better seating and air conditioning, and the harsh fluorescent lighting was replaced with better options that reduced eye strain and fatigue. James implemented an open-door policy, making himself available to workers at all levels. Every morning he walked the floor, talking with operators, listening to concerns, and addressing issues immediately when possible. The practice helped bridge the traditional gap between management and workers, creating an atmosphere of trust and mutual respect that had been missing for years. "Washington actually gets it," he overheard one veteran worker say. "He remembers what it's like down here." The comment meant more to him than any corporate recognition. Workers began approaching him directly with suggestions and concerns, knowing their input would be valued and considered. Production quotas were adjusted to allow for proper quality checks. Initially, some department heads worried about falling behind targets. But as defect rates dropped and worker efficiency improved, the numbers proved James right. Quality work required adequate time, and rushed production ultimately cost more in repairs and replacements. The changes affected people personally. Sarah Chen, who'd struggled with repetitive strain injuries, reported that the ergonomic improvements had eliminated her wrist pain. Young Marcus, now properly trained, showed promise as a skilled operator. Even the most skeptical workers began to see real benefits in their daily work lives. James established a worker safety committee, giving employees direct input into factory policies. Their first initiative was implementing a new system for reporting potential hazards without fear of retaliation. The program identified and corrected dozens of issues in its first month alone. Workers felt empowered to speak up about safety concerns, knowing their voices would be heard. Regular maintenance schedules became sacrosanct. No more rushed repairs or delayed inspections. James made it clear that production never trumped safety. When a critical machine needed unexpected repairs, he personally explained the shutdown to the corporate, backing his maintenance team completely. This commitment to proper maintenance gradually reduced emergency repairs and improved overall efficiency. The cafeteria transformed too. James replaced the old vending machines with healthier options and improved the break room facilities. He remembered his own lunches there, how a simple meal shared could build connections. Now workers had comfortable spaces to rest and recharge, promoting better morale and productivity. His own family felt the impact of these changes deeply. His mother's health improved significantly with access to better medical care and specialists previously out of reach. Teresa thrived in her engineering program, excited about implementing safety innovations she studied. She often visited the factory, seeing firsthand how proper management could create positive change. Even Michelle noticed the difference in her brother's demeanor. The weight of constant worry lifted from his shoulders. Ray visited monthly, walking the floor in working clothes, talking with employees. He and James would meet afterward, discussing progress and planning future improvements. Their shared vision of a workplace that valued both productivity and human dignity was becoming reality. Ray often cited Pioneer Steel as an example during corporate meetings, showing how prioritizing worker welfare could drive business success. 1 year after his promotion, Pioneer Steel won a national award for workplace safety innovation. James accepted it on behalf of the factory, but made sure the whole workforce celebrated. It was their achievement. He'd just helped clear the path. The recognition validated their approach and opened doors for further improvements. The factory's transformation proved that treating workers with dignity wasn't just morally right. It was good business. James's approach became a model for other facilities, showing that success didn't require sacrificing worker welfare for profits. The changes rippled beyond Pioneer Steel, influencing industry practices and corporate policies across the sector. 5 years after James's promotion, Pioneer Steel had become a model for industrial workplace reform. The factory floor hummed with well-maintained equipment, operated by workers who no longer feared speaking up about safety concerns. Production numbers reached record highs, proving that treating workers with dignity was good for business. James' office overlooked the factory floor where Teresa now led the safety engineering department. She had graduated with honors and joined Pioneer full-time, implementing innovations that protected workers across all company facilities. Her mother's photo sat on her desk, inspiring her mission to prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. Martha Washington had become a regular visitor to the factory, sharing meals with workers in the renovated cafeteria. Her improved health allowed her to volunteer at the local community center, helping other families navigate medical care systems. The scholarship fund James established had sent 15 local students to engineering school, creating a pipeline of safety-conscious professionals. Ray's experiment in disguise evolved into a company-wide policy of management immersion. Executives regularly worked alongside employees, ensuring decisions were grounded in shop floor realities. The practice, dubbed the Washington Protocol, spread to other industries, changing corporate culture beyond Pioneer's walls. Michelle's hospital adopted similar worker-focus policies after seeing Pioneer's success. She consulted with James about implementing safety measures and employee support programs in healthcare settings. Their collaboration helped improve working conditions across different industries. One morning, James arrived early to find industry executives touring the facility. They had come to study Pioneer's transformation, hoping to replicate its success. As he guided them through the factory, he noticed Ray standing quietly at the back of the group, dressed in work clothes, a slight smile on his face. "The numbers are impressive," one executive said, reviewing performance data. "But how did you change the culture so dramatically?" James led them to the cafeteria during lunch break. Workers sat in mixed groups, maintenance, operators, engineers, and management sharing meals and conversation. The old divisions had dissolved, replaced by a shared commitment to excellence and safety. "It started with a simple choice," James explained. "Seeing people as human beings, not just production units. Everything else followed from that." Later, James visited Angela's memorial garden outside the factory entrance. Workers maintained it voluntarily, adding plants and benches where people could rest and reflect. A plaque read, "In memory of those lost to preventable accidents, and in celebration of those working to protect others." That evening, during family dinner, Teresa shared news about her latest safety innovation being adopted industry-wide. Martha talked about her community work, while Michelle discussed healthcare reform progress. James watched them, remembering desperate nights at the kitchen table, trying to make impossible numbers work. "You did more than save our family, Dad," Teresa said softly. "You showed that one person's compassion can transform an entire system." James thought about that first shared lunch with Ray, how a simple act of kindness had opened unexpected doors. The lesson was clear. Character revealed in small moments could lead to profound changes. Pioneer Steel continued growing, but never at the expense of worker welfare. James's approach proved that profit and human dignity could coexist, creating a legacy that influenced industrial practices for generations. As he prepared to leave that evening, James passed his old workstation, now operated by a young worker he'd helped train. The factory that had once seemed like a prison of necessity had become a place of possibility, where doing right by people was just good business. The security guard nodded as James exited, daylight fading behind the factory walls. In his pocket, he still carried his old lunchbox, a reminder that the simplest acts of kindness could spark the most profound changes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.